What if there was a leak floating around online from a whistleblower who studied alien life forms and gave us all the full breakdown? In our last video in the series, we covered this leaker's background, how they got onto the project, and what they were studying. A microbiologist's take on the genetics of the Greys. I'd highly recommend starting with that video, linked down below. This video has some shocking connections and explanations for common modern areas of UFO and alien lore, including the infamous cattle mutilation phenomenon, potentially how creatures fly the craft, down to why do aliens stink.
And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. And she noticed a horrible smell immediately.
After watching both parts of this series, I'd love you to rate this supposed leak on a score from 1 to 10, with 1 being a sure hoax, 10 being a real leak, picking up where we left off, some wild connections right off the bat. I briefly introduced the differences in post-translational modifications, which are chemical modifications made to a protein after it has been fully assembled, between human and EBO. This is hardly a surprise, as we often see the same thing between different terrestrial species. Obtaining a viable protein from a DNA sequence is a complex process involving hundreds of protein intermediates, each with a precise and essential role. Minor variation in this assembly line can lead to functional irregularities in its final product. So it's no surprise that there are setbacks along the way when the first EBO gene transfection attempts failed to produce the desired functional protein in human cell lines. Fortunately for us, the work of what I imagine to be another team at another site has led us to the development of an EBO cell line named EPI-G11, derived from the epithelial tissues, which are the layers of cells that form the body's skin and line its internal organs. With this tool in our hands, we were able to transfect and overexpress proteins of interest in order to eventually purify and study them. For your information, we use a biological ballistics delivery system, aka a gene gun, for our transfection needs because other methods are not very effective with the cells of this line. For example, the viral vectors tested cannot be internalized by EPI-G11, and lipofection, which is trying to use small fat bubbles to smuggle in genes, is apparently too lethal. EPI-G11, like most eukaryotic cell lines, enters a phase of exponential growth when exposed to fetal bovine syndrome. It's only half surprising that a cell line from such an exotic source should be suggestive to the growth factors present in FBS. In my opinion, this can be explained by the addition of animal genes to the genome, such as growth receptors. Fetal bovine serum is extracted from, you guessed it, cows. My mind immediately goes to the cattle mutilation phenomenon.
But I will tell you that since the beginning of this year, there have been over 200 animal mutilations on Long Island. It's supposedly a big secret. I know that there's 4 major law enforcement investigations, investigators working in plain clothes.
On Long Island, New York?
Yeah, Long Island, New York. We have an investigator working with us who's sending us videotape and keeping us informed of what's going on. So it still is a problem.
And you say it's food. That's what they're doing.
Well, food or genetic experiments, take your choice.
Since the late 1960s, tens of thousands of livestock worldwide have been found dead with highly similar or even identical, highly anomalous surgical cuts. The animal carcasses are often left bloodless, and even removal of different organs, such as tongue, eyes, reproductive systems, and even unborn calves. Numerous researchers, scientists, and most importantly and notably the farmers themselves, are saying that these are not the work of predators. The leaker seems to point to the fact that they may actually need cattle parts to help create or stimulate growth within the Greys. Interesting. They are morphologically very similar to the Grey aliens that are part of modern folklore. Their height is about 150 centimeters. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Still, there are some notable differences. The gray skin that is often described in folklore is in fact a biosynthetic film, which likely serves to protect the EBO from a hostile environment. It doesn't provide effective protection against temperature changes, but it does offer adequate protection against the passage of liquids. It's possible this film confers other advantages, but my knowledge on the subject is limited. Under the gray film, the epidermis, which is the outermost layer of real skin, is rather white, and the texture is very regular without any hair. We do not see any defect other than the folds near the joints. It's described as greasy in one report, but that's not something I've observed. The same report states that a strong lingering smell of burnt hair and ammonia is present when the film is removed. There are a lot of pores on the skin, crossing from the epidermis to a gland in the hypodermis, which is the deeper layer of skin tissue. These glands and pores are the terminal part of the excretory pseudophorus system, which basically means they eliminate waste through their skin, like sweat, and could explain the previously mentioned smell. This of course is a direct link to alien lore. We hear all the time from numerous first-hand witnesses about the quote ammonia smell.
What do they look like to you?
They were about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, a sort of tan grey colour, very big eyes. They looked like undeveloped children in that their bodies were very sort of skinny, and they moved quite sort of rigidly. They shuffled rather than sort of walked. And I did notice a peculiar smell, like a sort of rotting vegetation smell.
The Varginha creature was supposedly running around the town trying to avoid capture, and it smelled really bad. According to our leaker, that could be because it was running around sweating, which is again how it excretes its waste. And now for the head. The head contains 2 large, oversized eyes, 2 nostrils without protuberance, a narrow mouth without lips, and 2 ear canals without auricles, which I didn't know auricles are the external flap of the ear. There is a mandible, but the musculature is vestigial. There are no teeth or tongue in the oral cavity. The nasal cavity where the nostrils meet is compact and does not rise cranially, but extends axially. There appears to be no equivalent to the olfactory bulb in the nasal cavity. The mouth leads directly to the esophagus, and the nasal cavity to the trachea. The trachea and esophagus do not communicate, which means they don't intersect. The Grey's lower jaw muscle being vestigial, or not really in use, is interesting. It seems like the Greys don't eat solid food. We've heard in plenty of cases that they don't talk with their mouths much, and they talk, stay with me here, telepathically. Breathing through the nose and eating only through the mouth seems like it solved the design flaw that humans have of breathing and choking. The next section is very interesting to me. Like the skin, the eyes are covered with a semi-transparent biosynthetic film that offers the same environmental protection while providing protection against certain wavelengths and light intensity. When the film is removed, a more traditional eye is revealed. It's about 3 times larger than a human eye, and there are no eyelids. The size of their eyes suggests they have excellent night vision. It seems paradoxical to cover them with semi-opaque film. Perhaps they only need to wear it in a bright environment. Their sclera, which is the tough outer layer of their eyeball, is the same color as their skin. The iris is pale gray, and the pupil is black and oversized. The lens is rounder than a human, and the musculature used to adjust the focus is more developed. On the retina, there are at least 6 types of cone cells. The responsiveness of each of these 6 types of cone is specific to the wavelength band with a minimum of overlap between each other. The result is a broader visible spectrum, and I have heard people, notably someone like Lou Elizondo, mention that people might see things different in an infrared light.
And as beautiful as those night skies are, if you were to look at that same portion of the night sky through a radio telescope, you would see a whole different reality around you. You'd see nebula, and you'd see things in different spectra that we can't pick up. You pick an ultraviolet and infrared, so you would see a whole different reality.
The famous black eyes essentially being lenses matches the claim from famous whistleblower Philip J. Corso.
Tell me about this here.
Well, this is similar to what it looked like. Now, the mouth is different. I didn't see any big mouth like that. No sex organs. The nose was not like that. The ear is about right. And that eyelid, finally, when it was analyzed, it was that it collected light, like our image intensifies.
I'm also reminded of this famous crop circle, the crabwood crop circle, that seems to show the creatures without their trademark black eyes.
The message is in English and reads as follows. Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain, but still time. There is good out there. We oppose deception. Conduit closing.
I did a deep dive on this crop circle, linked down below. The brain is tetraspheric, which is composed of 4 major sections. The sections are separated by transverse and longitudinal fissures and are connected to the central lobe, which acts as brainstem and cerebellum. The volume of the brain is around 20% superior to that of a man of the same height. It has a much more pronounced level of gyrication, or wrinkles, than the average human. Moreover, the ratio of glial cells to neurons is also slightly higher than in humans. It's important to mention the presence of nodules on the central lobe. Histological analysis of these structures reveals a kind of intricate biological circuitry. It is speculated that these nodules are essential to interact with their technology. Consequently, determining the proteome of these structures is an absolute priority for the program. We hear a lot from supposed UFO insiders. UFOs don't tend to have steering wheels. How do they operate? The brain nodules with circuitry are key. This explains it. Grays are linked to the craft themselves. The neck is proportionally longer than that of a human, and at the same time relatively thin. As mentioned, the esophagus and trachea are separate. There are no vocal cords in this region, which you don't need vocal cords if you're trying to connect to somebody's head directly to communicate. The musculature of the thorax is underdeveloped. Muscles equivalent to the pectoralis major can be seen. We also see the trapezius and deltoid muscles. The sternocleidomastoids, which I hope I pronounced that right, are well defined, and those being the muscles that run along the side of your neck that you can use to turn your head. The ribs and sternum are clearly visible. There are no nipples. No nipples means no direct breeding, the standard mammal way anyways. Again, all signs point to these beings being directly developed or created in some way. The abdomen is wider than the thorax and bulges slightly forward. There is no navel. The pelvic bones are apparent. There are no genitals or anus, right? Because as we mentioned before, skin pooping is a thing for them, and no reproduction. Their hands have 4 digits, including an opposable thumb on the medial side. They have no nails, and the texture of their fingerprints is composed of concentric circles. Fingers are proportionally much longer than humans. Unlike humans, finger musculature is entirely intrinsic to the hand. In other words, the muscles used to move the fingers are not in the forearms, but entirely located in the hands. At first glance, the feet consist of just 2 digits, but thanks to a necropsy, which is just an autopsy on a non-human body, soon determined that each toe was made of 2 fused digits. The medial or inner toe is marginally longer than the distal toe, which is the farther toe. The feet are relatively longer and narrower than a human. Their musculature, however, is vestigial. The EBO's endoskeleton is very similar to ours, at least in terms of composition. There's collagen, hydroxapatite, again I hope I pronounced that right, but also copper oxide crystals, where marrow would normally be found. The role of these crystals has not been established, but it is not a crystallopathic condition. The blood cells of the myeloid lineage therefore mature in a different location than in humans. For example, in the thymus-like organ, a transverse section of the bone reveals osteon and osteocytes, which are both vital for having bone structure. There appear to be few osteoblasts and no osteoclasts. This indicates that the bones are no longer growing and cannot absorb the minerals present or adapt mechanically to changes in posture. As I mentioned in part 1 of the series, these creatures are designed for a task. As it says here, kind of sad, if something goes wrong, these creatures are almost disposable. The copper crystals are very interesting here for a couple of reasons. Copper oxide is a semiconductor. Is the EBO's body built to interact with electrical systems in a supposed craft? I don't know, but maybe that's what it's insinuating. But here's a major point of interest going back to cattle mutilation. A document on cattle mutilation investigation states that in many cases, cattle livers were discovered, and I quote, completely devoid of copper, and to contain 4 times the normal amount of zinc, potassium, and phosphorus. The scientists performing the analysis were unable to explain these anomalies, taking cattle for their reproductive organs, but also siphoning their blood, and also taking all the copper. For the respiratory system, their cellular respiration is equivalent to ours. For example, they need to oxidize organic compounds to produce energy. Their lungs have no reciprocating action, but rather have a unidirectional flow of air, similar to those seen in birds, which is more efficient than ours. It is speculated that this is in response to the brain's elevated metabolic needs. Vocalization is produced by vibration of the wall membrane at the junction between the two air sacs. The circulatory system of EBOs is rather analogous to ours. The heart is located in the mediastinum, the standard central compartment or chest cavity, but in a more medial position. The heart has 2 ventricles and 2 atria. There is an aorta, a pulmonary vein, a pulmonary artery, and a vena cava. Blood flowing to the pulmonary capillaries, which are the microscopic blood vessels, via the pulmonary artery is pumped against the flow of air, maximizing gas exchange efficiency. The blood-gas barrier is relatively narrow in these capillaries, at least compared to a human. The oxygen-rich blood is returned to the heart and then expelled into the aorta and the rest of the body. Before returning to the heart, the blood will pass through the hepatorenal organ, which, among other things, filters and controls osmotic pressure of the blood. The blood itself is also analogous to that of a human. However, the proportion of plasma is higher. Albumin is in similar proportion. Hormone levels are much lower. Metal ion levels are much higher. And glucose levels are significantly higher. The color of the blood is brownish, given the higher proportion of plasma and concentration of metal ions. On the cellular side, there are erythrocytes, which, in addition to hemoglobin for binding oxygen, display several complexes capable of binding copper ions. It's not clear what role these copper ions play, but we believe it neutralizes blood ammonia, among other things. Several cell types with leukocyte characteristics have been observed, but no comprehensive knowledge of them exists. Platelets are present, but in smaller proportions than in humans.
What's the blood like? Is it blue and, jumps around on the floor or what?
Yes.
And he said, no, the blood is very similar to human blood, even with the cellular constituents. With one large exception was that there's a set of little small white cells called platelets. And the platelet reading, he said, was about 10,000 times higher than in human blood.
Wow.
And that it clotted almost immediately as it came out of the blood vessel. But he didn't know whether this was due to increased platelets or whether the blood was being exposed to an atmosphere that was different than where this thing had come from.
Continuing on to the skin, which, as we've said before, is interesting. The system is completely different from what I've seen. As mentioned earlier, there's no large orifice like an anus or urethra to get rid of biological waste. Instead, there are countless small pores on the surface of the skin. There's a large medial organ called the hepatorenal organ, which acts as both kidney and liver, and is central to maintaining homeostasis. This organ is highly vascularized, and the blood must pass through it before returning to the heart. Its role is, among other things, to purify the blood of metabolic waste. Waste is excreted into the equivalent of a ureter, which branches out into 4. Each branch flows toward one of the 4 limbs, and in turn these branches divide until they end up as thousands of excretory pores. The motility of this excretory system is mediated by a weak peristalsis at the proximal junction on the 4 main branches. Again, I'm doing my best with this, everybody. I know it's highly technical. Sorry if I'm butchering some of this along the way. Peristalsis ceases around the first distal junction. As there is no urocycle, the ammonia concentration at the exit of the hepatorenal organ is very high. This ammonia is carried to the pores and gives the distinct odor I mentioned earlier. The rationale behind this unusual excretory system is directly related to the excreted ammonia, which enables thermoregulation by evaporating on the skin's surface. The greater the physical effort, the greater the metabolism. This in turn leads to a rise in temperature and a corresponding increase in metabolic waste via amino acid catabolism. This leads to an increase in filtration and ammonia excretion, which ultimately lowers body temperature. We touched on it before. These aliens smell bad as they sweat ammonia.
Aqui na cidade, depois tem vários relatos interligados com isso, de algumas pessoas que viram e inclusive algumas pessoas que adoeceram por causa disto, né?
The digestive system is extremely underdeveloped. There's no stomach in the familiar sense. However, there is a pseudostomach located at the transition between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. This organ is not involved in digestion, but it serves only as a reservoir. A sphincter controls the flow of food into the intestine. The intestine is limited to the equivalent of our small intestine, i.e., It only serves to absorb liquids and nutrients and acts as the main digestion site. It has villi and microvilli, which are microscopic finger-like projections lining intestinal walls, like ours. The intestine ends up in the hepatorenal organ, where non-digested matter is transported to the ureter and excretory system. Residues are dissolved in the ammonia of metabolic waste for excretion. There's an organ near the pseudostomachal sphincter that secretes digestive enzymes directly into the intestine. This organ is inspirationally called the digestive organ. It secretes mainly proteolic enzymes and glycoside hydrolase, which are enzymes that help break down carbs into energy. Given the absence of teeth, the narrowness and rigidity of the esophagus, the absence of a true stomach, and the absence of defecation, it is strongly believed that the EBOs can only consume food in liquid form. It is assumed that given the high metabolic needs of their brains, this food would have a high carbohydrate concentration. In order to meet other metabolic needs, there must also be a high protein content in the food consumed. These two statements are supported by the type of enzyme secreted by the digestive organ. It is therefore speculated that the food consumed is a sort of broth rich in sugar and protein, which probably also has a high copper content. Given the strict limitations on the type of food they can consume, it's unlikely that this type of creature could survive in our biosphere without technological support. Again, designed here, survive on broth. This is technical, but we can kind of see it all coming together. It really drives home the point that these are biological drones. Knowledge of the endocrine system is minimal. We know that cells are receptive to bovine growth hormones, cows, so it's assumed that certain functions are regulated by such a system. Endocrine mechanisms are very complex, and it goes without saying that they are best studied on living subjects. The immune system is another unknown. There seems to be an innate immune system, but there doesn't seem to be any adaptive immunity, at least not similar to what is known. There's a thymus-like organ near the heart that's proportionally larger than that in humans. This organ seems to be where all blood cells mature. Some cells have eukaryote characteristics, such as granularity. The immune cells that germinate here have a high copper concentration. The surface receptors of innate immune cells have not yet been characterized, so we might as well say that all the work remains to be done. The nervous system is also relatively similar. The spinal cord begins at the base of the central lobe of the brain and propagates down the vertebral column. In the vertebrae, there are ganglia made of afferent and efferent neurons, which afferent are sensory neurons and efferent are motor neurons. In short, other than the central nervous system, nothing out of the ordinary. The musculoskeletal system is very ordinary, albeit underdeveloped. Most of the human skeletal muscles have an equivalent. Only the hands, feet, and forearms are different. It should be noted that the proportion of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers is different than that of a human. Indeed, type 1 outnumbers type 2 by a factor of about 10. Small note, this could lead to reports of witnesses saying creatures moved oddly or robotically. The last section, artificial system. We speculate that artificial molecular machines may be present in the body, and that copper, if present, would be essential to their function or assembly. Importantly, no AMMs have been observed, AMMs being artificial molecular machines. Fascinating, and it could tie in all the sections with copper, brain nodules, and the like. It sounds like nanotech, a blend of small machines floating around this creature. That wraps up the original, complex EBO leak. Before Reddit shadow banned the user and deleted the post and the mods had to get involved, they were answering a few questions. There's two important ones I want to touch on. One of them, they outright claimed that they work at Battelle National Biodefense Institute, a lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. The leaker did warn us they'd throw in some red herrings about where they worked, but still interesting to take note of. Finally, let's end with the fascinating document that the leaker supposedly read, a document centered around the being's supposed religion. EBOs believe the soul is not an extension of the individual, but rather a fundamental characteristic of nature, and expresses itself as a field, not unlike gravity. In the presence of life, this field acquires complexity, resulting in negative entropy, if that makes sense. This gain in complexity is directly correlated with the contradiction of living organisms in a given location. With time and the right conditions, life in turn becomes more complex until the appearance of sentient life. After reaching this threshold, the field begins to express itself through these sentient beings. forming what we call the soul. Through their life experiences, sentient beings will in turn influence the field in a sort of positive feedback loop. This in turn further accelerates the complexity of the field. Eventually, when the field reaches a quote critical mass, there will be a sort of apotheosis. It's not clear what this means in practical terms, but this quest for apotheosis seems to be the EBO's main motivation. The author of the document added his reflections and interpretations as an appendix. He specified that, for them, the soul field is not a belief, but an obvious truth. He argues that the soul loses its individuality after death, but that memory and experience persist as part of the field. This fact would influence the philosophy and culture of EBOs, resulting in a society that doesn't fear death, but which places no importance or reverence on individuality. This belief compels them to seed life, shape it, nurture it, and monitor it, influence it for the ultimate purpose of creating this apotheosis. Paradoxically, they have little or no respect for an individual's well-being. Please be advised I'm speaking from memory of something I read more than 10 years ago, so take the following with a grain of salt. Also, I'm not a philosopher or an artist, so please excuse my struggle to properly formulate the concepts in my dry terminology. Finally, note that this information comes from a document whose author was directly interacting with an EBO. It is not specified whether it was an ambassador, a crash survivor, or a prisoner. The means of communication were not specified either. This is, of course, very interesting. Of course, I'm thinking of Bob Lazar saying humans are nothing but, quote, containers of souls, in supposed documents he read.
I'm not asking you to say what you believe to be a fact. I'm asking you to say what you read in a report that is distributed at what may be the most top secret facility in the world. Okay, all right.
All right, I'll say it. It's so far out.
All right, your objection has been noted.
Okay.
What does it say?
That we're containers. That's how supposedly the aliens look at us. That we are nothing but containers.
Containers of?
Containers. Maybe containers of souls. You can come up with whatever theory you want, but we're containers. And that's how we're mentioned in the documents. That religion was specifically created so we have some rules and regulations for the sole purpose of not damaging the containers.
The souls? Meaning,
well, the souls or the bodies, whatever. Right? That's
meaning like we're containers for souls that they're going to use at some other point.
Right.
Overall, through this 2-video breakdown of the EBO leak, I'd love you to comment your thoughts down below on what you think. Is this a 1 and an obvious hoax? Is it a 10 and real? I'm personally going to give this a 5. I think it's likely that this is a person that is classically trained as a microbiologist, obviously way more technical than me, as we can see by their terminology, but it might just be someone who's very familiar with UFO lore and is weaving a very complex narrative around it. It does connect to a lot of the things we hear about in UFO and alien lore, but it could just be the same thing as me, somebody who's very interested in the topic but is trained in a different field. But again, I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments down below. Let me know what you guys want me to cover next, and stay curious. I'll catch you next time.